Chairman, when I was elected to Congress only 5 years ago, the debt was 21 trillion. Today, it's almost 33 trillion. So in 5 years, we've put 13 trillion on the debt, and it's a staggering number that seems almost incomprehensible, especially to those in my district. When I try to explain that Washington has a spending problem and we're not addressing and balancing our budget. I come from the state of Florida, where we were required by Constitution to balance our budget every single year. And so the legislature is very good about making sure that we're operating like you would operate your family or operate your business, and not getting ourselves into the incomprehensible levels of debt that we've gotten our country into. Unless Congress gets serious about our spending problem, the consequences of Congress's failure to govern responsibly will have a disastrous impact on the lives of several generations of Americans. It is true that deficit spending is nothing new. With only a few exceptions over the past several decades, the federal government spends more money than it receives every year. Since we do not actually have the money to pay for our spending, the government borrows money by issuing debt in the form of treasury bills, notes, and bonds. In just the past few years, the amount we are forced to borrow has grown dramatically. The national debt increased by almost 2.5 trillion just in this past year alone. Despite Congress's best efforts to bury its collective head in the sand, the bill will ultimately come due. The interest payments on our existing debt are growing at an unsustainable rate. In fiscal year 23, federal net interest payments skyrocketed up to $659 billion, a 40% increase from just the prior year. Debt servicing costs will soon be the second largest line item for federal spending, which will put it ahead of Medicare and defense spending. In recent months, both Fitch Ratings and Moody's downgraded their credit ratings on the government due to the large fiscal deficits and rising interest rates. We've been able to issue debt on favorable terms in the past because investors viewed them as a low-risk investment. Unfortunately, our bad decisions are catching up with us, and the market is starting to notice. We got away with spending like this for too long because interest rates were historically low. However, rates are on the rise, and our government does not appear to be ready for the consequences. Politicians from both sides of the aisle share blame for our addiction to spending money we do not have, and we are just now beginning to bear the consequences. Mr. Falkender, I'll start with you. Given the dramatic increase in debt servicing costs that we are experiencing, shouldn't this encourage Congress to tighten our belt instead of borrowing more money at a higher rate?
Certainly, yes. We definitely need to tighten our belts.
Your testimony points out that demand for Treasury securities at long-term bond auctions has declined. Why is that?
That's correct. So if we look at the last couple, there was a 10-year auction and a 7-year auction recently where there was less demand, particularly from international buyers. And so the prime dealers who participate, they had to soak up more of the issuances than they normally would have to.
Well, and you said too, what are the implications for that on the taxpayer?
So the implications are that yields, therefore, are going to be higher. The auction outcome at which the issuance actually goes through results in a higher yield, which means that interest payments are higher than what they were expected to be.
So in the last exchange with Mr. Pasquarello, Mr. Kogan was talking about if we were able to magically get $600 billion of people to pay what they're supposed to pay. Do you guys have any response to that, or do you have a difference of opinion on that issue?
Well, I think there's two parts, right? There's the tax gap, and then there's also, had we not engaged in some of the tax cuts. If that were the case, remember that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, for instance, made the tax code more progressive, not less. And so you're talking about a time of an affordability crisis for many American households, and the argument seems to be if only middle-class taxpayers were paying more taxes. Mr.
Smetters?
So even if we collected all the uncollected tax revenue, it's not going to come close to. It's still not going to balance the budget. It's simply the numbers aren't there, and that's a big hypothetical if we can even get a lot of that money. I mean, the bottom line here is, taxes have revenues come down, spending has gone up, and both sides are really to blame. And in particular, if you just look at spending for fiscal year 2023, it's about $700 billion more than you would have guessed just by trending the line pre-COVID. So both are happening.
You have anything to add to that in the remaining time? I
Yeah,
have?
so, I think $600 billion would be helpful if we could kind of improve that on that side of the ledger. And I think while I think some of the numbers that we've been throwing out are quite pessimistic, one thing I would want to communicate is the sooner we act, even if it's only partially acting, the better, whether it's on the revenue side or on the spending side. I think, it would not get rid of the deficit entirely. And, collecting $600 billion more in revenue every year would probably go some way to improving our debt trajectory, though how much is kind of is uncertain.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Steube. Ms. Tenney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for your expertise. We greatly appreciate it. Just want to first say one of the reasons we're here today